On the coast of South Wales, in the town of Port Talbot, stands one of the 6 large iron and steelworks left in Britain. The reasons why the iron and steel industry came to South Wales go back almost 200 years. It's one of the oldest industries in the area. Yet in the same industrial region, not half an hour away from the steelworks, you'll find industries that are difficult to beat for being totally modern and up to date. "200 years difference between the new and the old, and not just in their age either, but in the reasons why the industries came. And the clues to that story of industry still stand out loud and clear in the landscape of today.
What we'll be doing in this programme and the next is using these clues to find out why the old industries came in the first place, why they faded away, and what sort of new ones have taken their place.
It's this area on the map that we're interested in. Swansea and Cardiff are the 2 largest cities, and inland from them a practically non-stop mass of industrial towns. "200 years ago, it was a very different place. Just outside the industrial area, the countryside today still gives a good idea of what the whole of South Wales used to look like. Few outsiders ever went there. Those who did came away with stories of towering hills and wild valleys. What was to alter all that was 3 types of rock. You can still pick bits of them up from this hillside where they've been dumped over the years.
Ironstone, limestone and coal. The 3 raw materials you need for making iron. In parts of South Wales they found huge amounts of them. If you were interested in making a fortune from iron, then this was the place to set up shop. The rocks were all easy to get at, and they were very often, all 3 of them, right next to each other.
The ironworks gave Britain one of its first industrial landscapes. Such an amazing sight that artists came to paint pictures of the smoke and flames that had suddenly appeared in the middle of nowhere. Soon there were 10 iron-making towns going at full pelt. Those with money to invest in the industry had been quick off the mark. One of the iron companies became so rich they even printed their own banknotes. It was a perfect example of industry going to where the profits were, a message that we'll be hearing often in these 2 programs. For the next 50 years or so, away from the iron towns, the towering hills and wild valleys stayed untouched. But by the middle of the 19th century, another industry started to get interested in South Wales. The attraction for them was the lie of the land. In a typical chunk of South Wales, you get one river valley after another, with high hills in between. Underneath the surface, running through most of the area, there are layers of very high-quality coal. From the tops of the hills, it's a long way down to the coal, too far down, in fact, to mine it. But beneath the valleys, the coal is much nearer the surface, near enough for the engineers of that time to tackle it. Just a short shaft, and you were there. An underground coal mine. Nearly all the valleys had coal that was easy to get at, so it wasn't long before the coal companies spotted their chance and set up shop. It was the end of the remote, untouched valleys. Coal mining took over the landscape, lock, stock and barrel. It was a boom that lasted well into the 20th century. The jobs underground were incredibly tough. The coal was high quality, but the seams were thin, sometimes as thin as half a metre. So there was the heat, the damp, the dust, and the prospect of never being able to stand up straight. It was a time when people were on the move. In fact, there has probably never been anything like it in this country since. It was happening in all the booming industrial regions. Industry had moved in on the profits, and the people followed. In South Wales, the new arrivals trekked in from Cornwall, Somerset, Shropshire, and the country districts of Wales. Whether they got what they set out for is another matter. But it was the promise of regular wages that drew them in. After all, you could work 10 hours a day underground at the age of 12. By about 1920, 500,000 people had moved into South Wales to work in the new industries. Especially in the coal mining valleys, there was the problem of housing them. In South Wales, just as in all the other industrial areas of Britain that were booming at the time, the answer to the question, where do you put all the new people, was the terraced house. It was the cheapest and easiest way to do it, just a matter of building a long straight block of stone and dividing it up into separate houses. It was the flat bits on the valley floors that were built on first. When they were full up, there was nothing for it, but upwards onto the valley sides. It was houses, more houses, no matter what the lie of the land. And if you could get a few more in by aiming straight uphill, then why not?
In places, I can't help feeling that whoever built the houses was out to squeeze the last drop of space out of the hills overlooking the valleys. On this street, I reckon even an athlete would need a breather before making it all the way to the top.
The high spot of this chapter in the story of South Wales industry was reached about 65 years ago. Its roots were in coal mining and in steel making, which had long since taken over from the iron industry of the very early days. The area was near the top of the league of Britain's big industrial regions. The way out for the region's products was through the ports, the largest being Swansea and Cardiff. In Cardiff docks today, there are still just about enough clues left to those hectic days of 60 years or so ago. The days when the quaysides were crammed with ships. The days when trains were loaded up at the mines and steelworks and travelled down to the docks, to these sidings.
On an old map of Cardiff docks I got hold of, I counted the number of sidings. Give or take a few mistakes on my part, there were 225 of them.
The sheer size and number of them was due to the fact that most things that moved ran on coal. Railway engines did, machinery in factories did. And so did ships. When a ship needed refueling, a port would come to life as the coal was taken on board, often one sack at a time. Cardiff was also the headquarters of the coal business. It was run from this building, the Coal Exchange.
The place probably never saw a lump of coal in its life, but it was on the floor of this room that business deals in the coal industry were made. Companies who mined the coal sold it to companies who wanted to buy it. Tens of thousands of tons were traded every day. The place was a hive of activity and full of people, like in this old photograph taken on some special occasion. It was said that if you stretched out your arm on the floor of the Coal Exchange, you would, like as not, touch a millionaire. One of the biggest coal companies brought out this book to celebrate 50 years in the coal business. It tells how they started out by owning 3 coal mines and ended up by owning 22. They thought there was enough coal in South Wales to keep them going for 200 years. Now that, written in the year 1913, is another way of saying something we've mentioned before in this programme, that it was raw materials, or if you like, rocks in the ground, that first brought industry to South Wales.
But there's never just one reason why industry comes to a certain place at a certain time. There's often a whole string of them. I'm going to choose one more that was extremely important. It has to do with the places the goods were sent to from these docks. The same book can help us out.
There are a couple of pages here listing just some of their customers. There were steamship companies in South America, the Mediterranean and the Far East, ports and harbours all over the world where steamships called to load up with more coal, the navies of France and the United States, and railways in Europe, India and South America. What all that amounted to was a huge market for their goods.
It was the same story in all of Britain's big industrial regions at that time. Whatever they were producing, whether coal, steel, railway engines or ships, there was a market for what they made. If you've got a good market, you sell your products. If you sell your products, you make a profit. And profit, after all, is what keeps industry on its feet. The market for South Wales goods was truly enormous. The coal and the iron and steel were sold pretty well throughout the world. What helped the market at the time was the British Empire. Many of these countries were actually ruled by Britain, so it was easy for British goods to be sold to them. For getting on for 100 years, this was the easy market that Britain could rely on, a worldwide market. Take the railways of India, for instance, originally built by British companies from British iron and steel, and some of them run even on British coal. South Wales was in on this business. It had the right raw materials to make its products from, and it could easily sell them to a market in a country 9,000 kilometers away. The link with India was only one of many across the empire. Without them, industry in South Wales would never have reached such heights.
At a time like that, when coal and steel were doing very well, there were few people who stopped to think about the future. True enough, there had been some dreadful times, particularly in the coal industry, when thousands of men had been out of work for years on end. But industries always managed somehow to get back on their feet. After all, those two important things were still there, the raw materials and the market. In the next programme, we'll be finding out what happened to the old industries and looking at the new ones that have moved in.
In the first of these two films on the story of industry in South Wales, we saw how the area rose up to become one of Britain's top industrial regions. Its roots were in coal mining and steel making. I chose two important things that put those industries on the map. The region had the right raw materials and it had the right market for the goods it produced. These were the two supports that kept coal and steel going.
Our first job in this programme is to look at what's happened to those two supports over the years, and we'll start with coal.
About 40 years ago, a plan was put into action to modernise British coal mines. It was a question of rebuilding and new machinery. In South Wales, though, the biggest and the best of the new machinery found its way into only a small fraction of the mines. What was wrong was the coal itself. The seams were simply too thin to get the big machines in. As a result, South Wales has seen huge numbers of its mines close down. And in the meantime, the story of coal has gone much farther afield. And nowadays, if you need coal, you've got the world to choose from. You could, for instance, look towards the wide open spaces of the western United States. One sweep of the shovel delivers 10 tons of coal from a giant hole in the ground, coal that's easy to mine and cheap to produce. It's the same story with iron ore, the other important raw material that went into industry in South Wales. More man-made holes, this time in Australia. So much iron ore and so easy to get at that it's shipped to iron and steel works all over the world and still sold at a profit. It's the sheer scale of this kind of thing that's difficult to beat. So number one support for South Wales industry was in trouble. What about number two? Whatever they were making, whether it was ships, machinery or steel, the big industrial regions of Britain kept going because they were sure of selling what they made. Welsh coal and steel, for instance, went to the railways of India when India was part of the British Empire.